Carletta, rest in peace. Who have been my teachers in restorative justice as we transitioned it into transformative justice and really learning what it means to honor stolen land, stolen labor, and stolen lives in everyday practice. And maybe, as one of the practices to move us through the day, if you notice that your chest is getting tight or your breathing is short, please just take an extra moment for a deep breath. And maybe I'm going to ask you to do that now as we transition into moving away from this opening into really connecting with the incredible individuals that are on the panel. So please take a deep breath. So to my left is Fernando Bejon. He's the Executive Director of Urban Peace Institute in Los Angeles. UPI works to implement violence reduction strategies and smart justice solutions to transform systems, communities, and the lives of those most impacted by violence. Thank you for being here. To his left is Rima Chaudhry, and Rima is the Senior Program Manager for the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice. She oversees the nationwide implementation of restorative justice diversion programs that divert young people who have been arrested for felonies and high-level misdemeanors pre-charge to community-based restorative processes. Thank you, you justice warrior. And to her left is Jose Egurbide, and he is currently the assistant to the chief of the Criminal and Special Litigation Branch of the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office, maybe soon to be the United States Attorney's Office, because somehow that just came out and we're moving with the spirit today, so if that serves you, may you do that. Before that, Jose supervised the Los Angeles City Attorney's Neighborhood Justice Program, a pre-filing alternative prosecution program utilizing restorative justice principles to divert first-time offenders away from the criminal justice system. Thank you very much. And my bookend at the other end is Tanish Hollins, California State Director, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. And she is a crime survivor and a native of San Francisco, California. She has been deeply engaged in the Bay Area social justice movement as a community organizer, policy advocate, and systems navigator for nearly 2 decades. She has worked passionately to bring the voices of survivors to the center of community engagement and public policy, and has advocated tirelessly for those voices to guide decisions, priorities, and resources. Thank you so much for centering So we're going to begin with introductions, right? Please describe your work on restorative justice and healing. And I'm going to start it here, and we're going to be linear in this way, right? We're just going to keep the questions coming and move down the panel and try and have a little bit of time for creativity.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Again, my name is Fernando Bejon with Urban Peace Institute. We implement violence reduction strategies and smart justice solutions. So whether that's helping to transform how the county, one is addresses violence, but two, probation reform, alternatives to incarceration, etc. But also on the violence prevention and how to create enough space in communities for communities to really define what public safety is for them, and how to create space for peacemakers to engage those who are actively involved in violence to offer alternatives to that violence. Part of the work, and I'm going to focus on the peacemaking work, is working with gang intervention workers, those who have been formerly incarcerated, formerly gangbanging, left that life, and working on helping them transform into peacemakers. And that's a long process. What we found, initially we were working and we said, okay, this is what we're gonna do. What we found is that that healing component was necessary in order for them to be effective out there. There's law enforcement out there that is traumatized as well. You have young people that are out there traumatized. And I think the focus now on trauma, not only here in LA, but also statewide, it's really changing the conversation. I think we're getting closer to the core of what the issues are. And I think when we talk about a healing justice lens, we look at the war on gangs and the war on drugs and how they've devastated communities of color. Right now there's an opioid crisis and there's different lenses. The opioid crisis is not criminalized. The crack epidemic was criminalized and it devastated our communities, but it also created an economy, a mass incarceration economy. As we're looking at changing that dynamic is what economy are we gonna start developing as opposed to a mass incarceration economy? How do we change the economy to start investing back in our communities with a healing and a racial justice lens? We have to take into account the need to change the lens of drug abuse, change the lens of violence. It's not once a gang member, always a gang member. People can transform their lives. And for us, that's part of the narrative that we push. Part of the challenge, I think, at the systemic level is working with law enforcement to create enough space in order to allow peacemakers, those who are actively out there, to come back in and start to build peace in communities and start to touch those that are never touched, never talked to, only by law enforcement. I think for us, that's very transformative in our mind. How do we begin to transform how communities see themselves, how young people see themselves, but how do we align the systems in order to invest in that and create another economy around that of saving lives and allowing families to thrive. So I'll stop there.
Everybody, can you hear me okay? No. Okay, how about now?
Better.
Okay. Firstly, I want to thank everyone on the panel and just say it's an honor to be here, sharing this space with you all and sharing this space with anyone in the room as well. So a little bit about my work. We at Impact Justice, we have the Restorative Justice Project, and what we do is we work with systems partners, so district attorneys or state attorneys' offices, whatever they're called in their local jurisdiction, prosecutor's office essentially, and community-based organizations to provide training and technical assistance in all of the nitty-gritty logistics that it takes to launch a restorative justice diversion program aimed for youth who've committed or have been arrested for a very serious harm, to go through a 10-month-long process that includes preparing them, preparing the person that they harmed, for what culminates into a face-to-face dialogue where they have where they're face-to-face, and they also have their caregivers and support network there as well. And everyone shares the impact of the harm on them and on their community. And after that, they come up with a consensus-based plan for the young person to make it right. And consensus-based is really important. That means that the young person themselves has to say, I can agree to this, or I don't like this, let's change this out. Everyone has buy-in in the process, and it's part of the trust building, it's part of the accountability process, that the young person is part of the decision making of what it means for them to make things right. This model is pre-charged, so that means that this is an intervention point that prevents them from having further contact with the system after they've been arrested. And once they've completed the plan, the community-based organization reaches out to the district attorney's office and lets them know that it's completed. The district attorney closes the case with no charges ever filed, and it's done. One of the things that we do is look for a community-based partner that doesn't necessarily have experience in restorative justice or these different technical pieces. We offer that. We look for organizations that are deeply rooted in their community, and the community that's ultimately going to be where the young people and the people harmed come from. And there's an emphasis on that being within communities of color. I hear that there's been a retreat on racial justice, so you all are familiar with what happens when you make these sort of programs or policies race neutral. the people that are being disproportionately impacted by incarceration ultimately don't get served at the same rate as they are being incarcerated. So we emphasize having organizations that we partner with have deep connections with the community of color there. We also do a lot of data analysis and research to identify the arrest types that youth of color are disproportionately being arrested for, as well as geographic areas. So we do all of that in order to find ultimately the areas with the most need. We're currently in San Francisco County, Alameda County, Contra Costa County, and here in LA County. And we also have a program in Nashville, and starting in Miami, Philadelphia. And I can talk more about the healing side of things, but I think in the interest of time, I'm gonna pass the mic and we'll talk more about that.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jose Agurbide, and I've been. Can you all hear me?
Better, yeah.
I've been a prosecutor for 24 years. The last 5 years, I've been managing our neighborhood justice program, which is a restorative justice-based program. Like my colleague was saying, the format is very, very similar. So rather than kind of tell you about how we intercept individuals and move them away from the criminal justice system, I'd rather tell you a little bit about why this is very personal to me and why I do what I do. I think you've probably talked about trauma. We're going to talk about trauma, and everybody has trauma. And it's very personal. And when I see my participants, I see me and them. And so, for me, the last few years, it's been a deep dive into restorative justice, personally and professionally. And it's allowed me to really dive into my work and connect with individuals that are just young people that made a mistake. And so when that happens, restorative justice as the tribal values of that there's no one individual in the tribe that you should throw away, that you have to successfully reintegrate every member of the tribe back in. Restorative justice values of inclusion, encounter, amends, and reintegration. Those are the things that I've tried to create in our process as a prosecutor, which, just the mention of being a prosecutor, I know in restorative justice circles and criminal justice reform conversations can sort of trigger some people. And I think it's very important that we all realize that rather than us and them, we just have to move to the we. Because this isn't something that we're going to solve in silos. And if we are trying to create community, we have to redefine what community means for everybody. And then assist individuals that are getting caught in the criminal justice system and focus on self-care. Because I think, to me, these programs have to be about self-management, self-care, and transformation. There's plenty of literature. I brought like 100 brochures on our different alternative prosecution programs and on the neighborhood justice program specifically. So if you're interested, grab one of those, but I'd rather spend my time telling you why I'm passionate about this work. And in February of this year, I got promoted to the assistant chief to the criminal branch of the city attorney's office. My hope is that in that new role, I can start enhancing the use of restorative justice and start intercepting more folks that are getting caught in a very transactional and punitive system, and redirect them to a process where we treat them with dignity, with respect, and we support them in successfully reintegrating into the community. Thanks.
It's a great honor to be here with all of you today. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the brother to the right of me. Can you hear me now? Perfect. Thank you. Grateful to be here with all of you today. And before I begin, I just want to honor this brother to the right of me for entering the conversation in that way. I see you and I appreciate you for that. I could tell you about our organization and what we do at Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice in organizing crime survivors throughout the state and creating spaces for healing, creating opportunities for folks to be seen and to, probably for the first time in their lives, identify as a crime victim and a crime survivor. And that includes me, someone who entered into this position about 8 months ago as state director, but who spent 15 years working in city and county systems in the Bay Area, serving families, serving folks in crisis, serving my community. And what my entree into CSSJ was after the death of 2 of my brothers who were killed in the same neighborhood that we grew up in, the same neighborhood that I represented in the mayor's administration for 6 years, the same community that I organized in, and by people that we knew personally. That context for this work changes everything. I did not own an identity as a crime victim coming into that work because, quite frankly, Black and brown folks from my community are not seen as crime victims. And there's a historic context for that. There are policies that have supported that for decades. And a big part of what we do in our organization is creating space for folks to be able to humanize their experience in a way that doesn't happen outside of the room, doesn't happen when an incident of crime happens to them or to their loved ones, and allows them to take some agency and ownership of their healing journey, the right to heal. There are different reactions to that when I say it. Sometimes survivors say, you know, I don't like the framing of that to say that I have the right to heal. That's very telling. That's very telling because systems, including the justice system, has reinforced that thinking, has not created space or opportunity for what we now call restorative justice, but it is truly indigenous practice, things that we have done throughout history to heal our communities. And so I'm really proud to be connected to an organization that prioritizes that, restoring the dignity and humanity of folks who don't often get to see themselves in that way, don't get to tell their stories, and don't get to be a part of shifting the narrative. Shifting the narrative also allows us to center on what's most important in the healing work and allows us to be able to define it. That is what we're doing throughout the state. We have a chapter here in Los Angeles. We have several up in Northern California, a new one in the Central Valley, another down in San Diego. Survivors have been coming together all over the state to identify new safety priorities. For years now, the safety priorities have really been defined by law enforcement and quite frankly by communities that don't experience crime and violence at the rate that we do in the communities that are represented here in this room today. And so we are creating a new platform that really does center on shared safety, that expands the identity of who crime victims are, and who's deserving of empathy, and who's worthy of being seen and held in the moments when they're experiencing the most trauma, with recognition for all of the traumas that they've experienced throughout their lives and up until that moment. And that includes folks who are identified in the system as offenders. The other big part of that narrative shift is breaking down that polarization of who committed a crime versus who experienced it. The entire community experienced it. And so it's incumbent on us to heal the entire community in a way that's different.
So as the county and community learn more about alternative accountability models, what does accountability look like to you? Especially as we're imagining accountability without cages.
I mean, accountability is an important word. I think when we're looking at the criminal or the justice system, we're looking at what are the values. Do we value, give people a chance? Do we value rehabilitation, or is it just punitive? Accountability, and it comes in different ways. I was actually having a conversation yesterday about this, and we were having a conversation about the severity of the crime, right? at what level can things be reconciled, or at what level do people need time out, right? A lot of times in the community, particularly with homicides and murders, people are out there committing chaos. People need that time out. People are gonna have to go away for a bit. Other levels of offenses, how do you bring it back and restore communities? So at the community level, restoring communities, you're investing, you're allowing communities to thrive, you're building a system where people can actually live, whether that be housing, etc. But also at the individual level, when someone does harm to you and there's space to reconcile in order to bring harmony back to the community, I think for me that's transformative. That's challenging the values of how the criminal justice system has been built, how communities and individuals have been criminalized. It really comes back down to our values, and our values are reflected in the budget line items. How much are we willing to invest in implementing restorative justice structures so that communities can live in harmony, so that communities can begin taking responsibility for their public safety? And it's not just on law enforcement. It's not just on law enforcement to come in and arrest their way out of any issue. So it's really, it challenges an economy that's been built around criminal justice. So as that changes and that evolves, is how are those funds reinvested to build structures that allow communities to start taking responsibility for public safety? A lot of times that from a systemic level or even a bureaucratic level say, hey, we're gonna implement this program and the community's gonna love it. But if there's no investment at the community level and there's no buy-in, it's not gonna work. And for us with violence reduction strategies, if communities are not at the table and they're not being invested in, and we have a community policing program and law enforcement's gonna get the money, that's not gonna work. Because people have to be invested in, communities have to be held accountable for what they say they're gonna do. If they're gonna work with active gang members, they better not be working with their cousins and just friends that aren't even involved. They gotta work with active gang members, you gotta hold them accountable for that. But also at the systemic level, there has to be accountability for coordination of efforts. How are you leveraging resources? How are you sharing information in order to make sure that you're targeting the most impacted individuals and communities? So accountability for me, there's that individual level community. As a neighbor, as a brother, as a sister, as a community member, we have to be accountable to each other and transform that culture of violence and say, this isn't the way we're gonna live. At the community level, or how are we strengthening community, building cohesion, and at the systemic level, or how are we holding system leaders, agencies accountable for continuing to invest and creating pathways for funding to address the issues at its core. So for me, I mean, accountability is essential. It's very difficult. A lot of times accountability requires uncomfortable conversations. It requires facing somebody, whether it be your accuser, right? My staff hold me accountable. My community holds me accountable. Intervention workers hold me accountable. I just came out of being held accountable for something. But you face it because you respect each other and it's about a bigger vision that is a different value. And as we don't want to work in a way where it's transactional, where we say, hey, we're going to provide this service for you. We hope everything's all right. How do you make it transformational? And with UPI, our goal is always, we want to look at transformation. How you transform someone, help someone transform their lives as an individual, who's maybe a former gang member, into a peacemaker. How to help transform communities so communities can thrive and actually be at the table and articulate what community safety is to them. And at the systemic level, holding systems accountable for addressing the issues that they help create.
Okay, let's clap it up.
So, from what I've last read, the U.S. incarcerates 2.3 million people. 2.3 million people. Is that better? And Javier, we were just talking outside. You said if our system worked, then we'd be the safest country in the world, given those numbers. And I believe it's somewhere around 5 million people who are under some form of incarceral control, whether it's parole, probation, or some form of that. And so what we can safely say is that our current way is just not working. But on a mainstream level, people are not exposed to other options, other ways of addressing harm within their communities, or other ways of addressing harm that are proposed on a more systemic level. And so I feel like taking a step back, and we're talking about accountability without cages, there needs to be a cultural and paradigm shift about what people as a collective, as a whole, as society envisions when it comes to safety and justice and accountability and healing, in order for people to see that there is another way that they can be seen and heard and be well. And so, you know, you mentioned public safety, and I think part of that paradigm shift is really breaking open this assumption that public safety is policing. Public safety is so much more than just policing. It's wellness, it's health centers, it's making sure that communities have active employment within their community that offers a livable wage. It's nurturing families and family support networks. It's ultimately having resilient communities. And, you know, resilient communities have everything that they need to address harm amongst themselves without bringing in other people, without bringing in systems actors. And, you know, the work that I do is focused on felonies and high-level misdemeanors for a reason. Oftentimes we see diversion efforts focus in on lower level crimes or lower level harms, and what we show is that even with the most what we could say egregious things that happen, there is still healing to be found, both from the person who's experienced the harm and the person who's committed it. One thing that I hear often that I really deeply appreciate that centers and grounds me in the work is that you are more than just the worst thing that's ever happened to you and the worst thing that you've ever done. To me, that is the source of accountability and healing and community.
To me, the concept of accountability, I think we can all agree that for a long time, you know, the criminal justice system has been confusing warehousing and isolating individuals with somehow holding them accountable for whatever they've done. Individuals can do terrible things when they've had trauma in their lives, or when they feel isolated, or when they're just, you know, existing on survival mode. And in that respect, you know, even though our program and our office jurisdictionally only focuses on adult misdemeanors within the city of Los Angeles, I see a lot of our participants that are low risk, but high needs. And it's because of these root causes, the trauma, level of trauma, the experiences that they've had in their life, the fact that they're operating in survival mode. And so I think for me, there's no conversation about accountability without having a conversation about needs and addressing those needs. When you invite somebody into a restorative justice process, there's an accountability aspect to the people that are putting that process together. We all have a responsibility. The individual that, you know, violated a relationship with the victim and the community have a responsibility, but we also have a responsibility to assist them and to help them in terms of self-care, increased empathy and compassion, and increased resiliency. And different folks do it differently. For us, we try to focus on emotions and the thoughts associated with those emotions, and then how do we change the behavior that follows. So in our office, we're starting to get more and more into mindfulness as a way to assist individuals in having some practical tools that can help them, you know, maybe when they're all by themselves in the middle of the night and there's not a program or there's not a link that they can go to. And so that's accountability for me, moving away from isolation, from blame, from judgment. And I think if we want to successfully reintegrate individuals, we as a community have a responsibility to make them feel welcome once they've taken responsibility and held themselves themselves accountable for what they've done and repaired the harm.
The question around accountability is not an easy one to discuss with people who have been victims of crime and crime survivors. It becomes even more difficult when you're talking to populations of folks who have never experienced justice, whose definition of justice looks very different than the Webster Dictionary definition of justice in the systems that we all in our mind imagine are supposed to work when people are victims of crime. So when we think about accountability, one of the first things that we think of is shared safety, and that's a principle that it really guides our work within our organization, but it really is the foundation for all of the work I think that we're doing. No one person, no one community, no one population should be safer than the other or less safe than the other. So when we're creating systems of accountability, we have to look at that equity. That's really important. The other thing is really centering on folks' experiences in the totality of their experience and creating new environments to be able to address that. We're imagining things that don't exist yet. When we're talking about systems of accountability, this is really our imagination. How are we projecting something that's new? It may not be fixing something that we have because what we have is clearly not working. So how do we do that? How do we create spaces for people to own their whole experiences, but also to heal? You know, we talk to crime survivors about their experiences, and people are at very different levels of their healing journey, especially when someone's child has been murdered, when someone has been violated in a very personal way. What does accountability look like? How do we bring back the humanity in each of those individuals to begin a healing process that's collective? One thing that constantly comes up is if someone is being held accountable for a crime, they should also be accountable for their healing process, and there should be support for them to be able to do that. Now, where that happens, what venues they happen in, that's something that we need to continue working through and working on, but we all agree that it's not jails and prisons. So what is it? And I think that, centering on the folks who have experienced the most harm will help us to get there.
Why is individual and community healing and restorative justice important in the context of expanding diversion and alternatives to incarceration? How does it apply to the ATI mission of Care First, Jail Less?
I like the idea of the imagination, as we're imagining something that maybe doesn't exist, or reimagining, rebuilding, or reinstituting something that has existed, right, for generations. I mean, communities have the kind of unique opportunity to adjust, just like a family, and communities are really just networks of families. Families can adjust and reestablish itself, right, and kind of restore itself in many different ways. And that's kind of the power and what's allowed a lot of people of color to survive kind of years of oppression, as well as all these policies and war on gangs and drugs. I think it's really bringing in healing justice, a racial justice lens, restorative justice is really trying to integrate these values and reimagine what the criminal justice system could look like, where it is not overly punitive, where people have the opportunity to make mistakes but also reconcile those mistakes. Providing somebody that opportunity is life-changing. As we close those community to prison pipelines and as people come out, we also need to create space at the community level for people to exist, for people to thrive. So when we talk about the valuing, bringing, restorative justice and healing into our communities, we also have to take into account that the system needs to kind of reimagine how it looks at human beings. My work, I always say we're trying to reclaim our dignity as people. A lot of my work, throughout the country and even before I was doing this work in Chiapas was really about indigenous people fighting to reclaim their dignity as human beings because they did not count, because they did not produce for society. So those who do not count and cannot produce for society are put into cages and being labeled invisible. So for me, it's reclaiming our dignity. Oh, I'm sorry, I was like, well, I'll stop. I'm sorry, I don't want to go too far. I don't want to go too far. We'll reclaim our dignity, right? How do we make those who have been invisible, those who do not count, visible? And Black Lives Matter. If Black lives don't matter, our lives don't matter. That's the way I see it. For us, we have to make ourselves visible, and we have to prove to people how human we are. We have to prove to people that we deserve our dignity. And a lot of times it's not given to you. You have to be imaginative, you have to organize, you have to fight, you have to struggle for it. And that's just the reality that many people grew up with. But for me, my kind of personal thought on this is really just to say, if we can change the values of the system and start to see ourselves differently, I think we can start creating a different world.
So first, I'm looking at the question about individual and community healing, and I think this goes back to that paradigm shift that I was mentioning earlier. And we live in such an individualistic society where even like this question framing the individual and community healing kind of reinforces that idea that the individual is separate from the community. And I don't believe in that. I believe that, I'm just throwing out a lot of sayings now today, but I am because we are. It's the concept of Ubuntu, that we are interconnected. So if my neighbor is not well, then that impacts me. And it is my responsibility to make sure that I'm doing all I can to heal them, because their healing is my own. And with that said, I also believe in an intersectional approach to any sort of community healing and even community healing, policy change, what have you. So if you're looking at the conditions of harm occurring in a community, we can't look at that harm in isolation of the other factors that are impacting that person or that community. The example that I often use from when I was in policy, when I was in my public policy program some years back, was that if you are looking at a community, a school within a community that is under-resourced, and you just put money into the school hoping that grades will increase or test scores will increase, then it's a failed experiment, because the young people spend just a few hours in school and then they go home. And there are so many other systems failures that happen within that community that are impacting that young person's life, that the system failure of an under-resourced school is just one part of it. So if we want to change conditions within communities, and I'm talking about communities of color in particular, then we have to look at the whole ecosystem that has failed them, that has led to the outcomes that we're talking about today. So if we're talking about healing, then we also have to look at that whole ecosystem and not just think about reducing recidivism or restorative justice in the instance of a harm, but what are the root causes and what are the systems failures that are leading to the harms that those young people are experiencing, and then making that become a cycle of violence.
I think in terms of restorative justice, we all need to heal. Certainly in the criminal justice system. I live in a very adversarial system. So as a restorative justice practitioner, on the daily, I'm battling even my own colleagues as to how to implement and get support for the work that I do. But when you talk about healing, it's back to the needs. What the individual that is now criminal justice involved, what are their needs? The victim, what are their needs? The community, what are their needs? And I think that's where restorative justice allows for this intimate conversation where you can learn about each other's stories, and you can go through a process. You can create a program same way every time, and allowing the parties to learn about each other, have a natural sense of curiosity. And if the process allows for that, that's what leads to increased empathy. That's what leads to compassion. That's what leads to an honest apology from one side to the other, and forgiveness. So restorative justice to me is really more than just the outcomes. It's really more than recidivism rates. That's what an elected official, sort of hangs their hat on in order to support a program. But for me, restorative justice is the process, because that's what leads to transformation. And I'll leave you with this. We've trained over 400 volunteers throughout the community about restorative justice. I now teach it in law schools, so I get to shape young minds about restorative justice. But our volunteers, many of whom came into the process thinking, I'm law and order, and I can't wait to meet with these criminals and punish them and give them, some serious consequences. And on the back end now, they've been transformed. The encounters that they've had has led to them coming to me and saying, it's changed my life. It's made me a better husband or a better wife, or a better friend, a better colleague, a better worker. And so that's the beauty, I think, of restorative justice, that it's not just healing those who are getting caught in the criminal justice system. It's healing those that are coming into contact with it and participating in it, which is beautiful.
I think about the individual healing and community healing process. There were two things, and one kind of came with the brother at the other end of the book, the beginning of the book, mentioned about our connectedness in community. A couple weeks ago, I was in Montgomery, Alabama, and got to visit the Legacy Museum. And one of the very striking things for me in that visit, as you go in, they give you an overview of just the history of slavery in this country, but in particular the impact in Montgomery, Alabama, the hub, where so many black bodies were farmed out throughout the country, that more than half of the families who touched that soil were separated upon arrival. And when you think of that in that context, and not just for the black experience, but for all of our experiences, how many of us have had to migrate for safety or traffic places against our will, connectedness looks very different. So your individual healing process is then part of a whole, right? If you feel me snap or something, it's too quiet. All right. So that it's very important to see ourselves in that way. And then when we think about reclaiming humanity, I personally don't have the time or interest in trying to help people see my humanity. What I have the time and interest for is mirroring humanity to the people who are experiencing what I'm experiencing. Because if we're able to reclaim each other's humanity, then it's not about whether or not someone sees us in that way. It allows us to walk in our dignity, which is going to be what transforms all of this in the end, right? In terms of community, we need access, right? So it is that mirroring, it is that connectedness, it is about being able to hear and share each other's stories, but it's also about being intentionally creating spaces and resources and opportunity for people to have access to tools for healing. So one of the things that CSSJ has been able to do, and we take great pride in, is advocating for the expansion of the trauma recovery centers in California. And our goal is for every community to have a trauma recovery center, that there's no wrong door for you to access, that there are no barriers to you being able to access services for mental health, for traditional indigenous healing practices, for counseling, for support. Anyone in this room, most of us in this room who have tried to access a resource when we needed it had to jump through a series of hoops. And I don't care if you have been a city and county civil servant and you have great benefits, you've had to go through a process to get a service. We need to reduce the barriers to be able to access those services for everyone. And we also need to take down, again, that culture shift around who is worthy of healing and make that accessible for everyone everywhere.
Appreciate you, a true organizer, already organizing the room and giving you a task list. And because I am your sister in the struggle, I'm gonna do the same. So we have about 5 more minutes on this panel, and as a closing question, you know, it's the to-dos, right? The homeworks. What do you do from here? How do you build off of what you've just heard? So one is I'm gonna ask you to commit to healing and justice personally and professionally. You can't trick yourself out of it. You can't fake your way out of it. It will come to your face and challenge you. And those of you that are smiling are being honest about it. Thank you for your honesty. So really commit to it personally and professionally. Really connect to someone in this room. You know, the panel is incredible, and I know there's a lot of folks in the room that are doing important work. Find your appropriate partners so that you're not doing this work alone. And be in community, right? Be in community. So I'm gonna ask the panel, and if we have an extra minute, I'm gonna ask the room, right? What are the existing spaces that exist where it's open enough and welcoming enough, where folks can continue the learning, the imagining, the creating of community safe spaces?
You don't have any, it's okay. Where can people go if they want to continue this conversation?
Well, shout out to Youth Justice Coalition. And there's the folks in LA County. I was just at Chuco's Justice Center. They're doing really dope work out here. And so that's out here. I'm based in the Bay, so I can't speak more on that, but I will say, just a plug for my work, because that's what I'm here to do. We have a toolkit. It's rjdtoolkit.org. We realize that our capacity as a team to be providing training and technical assistance everywhere that the need is just not there. And so we created this toolkit to collectivize the knowledge. In this toolkit, there's so many resources on restorative justice and healing practices and how to embody that on an interpersonal level as well as systemic levels. I was just joking about plugging my work. I really do think it's a great tool for folks if they want to learn more about these sort of healing modalities and how to incorporate that within their communities and counties.
Can you say the toolkit again?
rjdtoolkit.org.
I just want to pass on my email to all of you, and if you have some ideas or suggestions or anything that we can work on or do better or incorporate into our work, I would love to hear from you. As far as where, our panels are intentionally in the community, because we're not trying to create a community court that's brick and mortar and it's just it's still a court, but in the community. We're trying to create a safe space for individuals to feel that connection and to have that sort of structured dialogue through a neutral facilitator. And that needs to be, if we are talking about successfully reintegrating folks, has to be in the community. So my email is jose.egurbide, EGURBIDE, @lacity.org. And I would love to hear from you, invite you to observe a panel if you would like, and I hope to learn from what you all are doing as well. Thanks.
We'd love to invite you all to visit cssj.org. I mentioned earlier that we have survivor chapters throughout the country. Well, actually, we are a national organization, so you'll get to see our national work there too. But in California, we have 7 chapters. We do have an LA chapter. So if you're in LA, please connect. We are also in the Bay Area, San Francisco and East Bay. So if you Bay Area folks in here, please connect with us and anywhere else in the state. If you are system impacted, you please visit timedone.org, because that is another significant part of the work that we do. It's the other arm of our plane, helping folks who have been impacted by the system, removing those barriers, putting a definition to rehabilitation, and putting an end to the tether that you have been connected to the justice system. And if you identify as both a survivor and someone who's been impacted by the system, know that you have space and that you are welcome.
Can you repeat the website one more time?
cssj.org and timedone.org.
Correct?
Correct.
Jose, can I ask you if people wanted to?
If people wanted to volunteer to become RJ facilitators, how can they do that?
We in our city attorney website, we do have a link to, and it actually has an electronic volunteer panelist form that you can fill out. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Officer of Diversion and Reentry, which it works with one of our programs, LA Door, on dealing with chronic addiction, or chronically addicted individuals. But yeah, the applications are right there. You can fill them out electronically, or you can just contact me at my email, and I'll be happy to send them.
Just want to let folks know that the Youth Justice Coalition has 2 monthly spaces. It's the Transformative Justice Practitioner Space, the first Wednesday evening, dinner and circle, and then the third Wednesday is a community alternative to 911 to continue to build safe communities together. Any other pressing announcements?
We will have time in the table discussions to add more of this. I just want you to know.
Okay, great. And then can we also keep up a post-it so that folks can add on there?
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Ross?
Yeah, I'm sorry, burning question for Jose.
Hold on 1 second.
I'm sorry. Burning question, particular for Jose. First, great presentations and a really enlightened approach to how we need to move forward as a community on this issue. But I'm interested in, particularly in the job you do, you introduce the concept of the notion of restorative justice approach to a victim or a family of a victim. And they're not there, right? Their thing is, thank you for explaining this to me. I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in an apology. I'm not interested in a conversation with the person who did it. I just want them behind bars. So when they're in that place, how do you respond? What is your reaction?
I want folks to remember that question. Remember that question. Because I'm going to turn it over to Jose because that's Dr. Ross and I can't mess with that, right?
It's okay.
But really, I feel like those questions are critical to rooms and literally letting everyone answer them, right? Not just looking at one expert to have the answer, but really bringing it into circle process and really allowing multiple people to answer these incredible questions.
Thank you, and I don't consider myself an expert, just a practitioner, but, and Dr. Ross, thank you for your original support to the Neighborhood Justice Program back in 2014. You helped us kind of get launched. But to answer the question, in my research of restorative justice, there's some restorative justice programs that are very victim-centric, some that are very offender-centric, and I think we need to have a balanced and restorative justice approach like they use in juvenile justice, where you focus equally on both. Because you have to meet the needs of both as well as the community. So we do not say to a participant, oh, the victim doesn't want to participate in the process, so you're excluded. Regardless of how the victim feels, if they want to participate, they can. If they don't want to participate, they don't have to. If they want to submit a victim impact statement because they don't want to show up to the conversation, we still have community members that can talk about whatever harm or whatever impact was caused on the community. And so they act as some sort of a proxy victim. So we don't make it a requirement that the victim participate. I hope that answers.
So,
I just wanted to quickly add to, I know we're tight on time, but I just wanted to say.
It's just that we do have another and very important process of listening, and then we also have time for circle discussion, and I don't want to sacrifice that. So keep your last comment. I'm going to ask the public for just some help here because we want to get you into the circle discussion, but we have another very important activity that needs time as well. So last comment, and I'm sorry that I'm interrupting.
Sure. So I'm just going to slide this in. We do extensive research on the sites that we work with, and preliminary research shows that there's a 91% victim satisfaction rate with the RJD process, Restorative Justice Diversion process. And And we don't have comparable data from the criminal justice system because they don't ask. They don't ask what the victim's needs are, if they want this to go a different way, if they're satisfied with the outcomes. But with our process, it's a 91% participant in person harm satisfaction rate.
Kruti, thank you so much.
Centering victims. Thank you so much, Madeline.
Let me just, can we hear your question and your comment, but not necessarily reply to it real quickly, but at least hear it? Can we do that? Yeah, please do that. Yeah, here. All right.
I know I was going to be very upset.
Thank you for understanding my question.
I was tasked 2 years ago as a representative of Black Women for Wellness to put together mental health workshops across about 4 or 5 different cities in LA, spas, I think the language is for Department of Mental Health. I was able to, what I did was, we were addressing mental health trauma as it relates to Black women, and what I was able to find was there's a plethora of Black healers in LA. I'm talking about that from 30 years that teach Tai Chi, that teach self-defense, other types of self-defense, yoga, and there's no organized network, so to speak. And so I was able to put together a resource guide. Now, the beauty of your program is that you've invited in 2 healers. The healers should be in the room to have this dialogue with you, to let you know what's being offered. I also am with the Center for, the Earth Lodge Center for Transformation. We're building an Earth Dome starting next week, phase 2. The belief is that plant medicine, working with the earth, heals. And I know that our indigenous folk know that really well. So that's in Long Beach. I just wanted to please see me if you are interested in some of those resources.
Thank you so much for bringing that into our business and our awareness of the assets and healers in our community. Thank you again. So let's take a 2-minute stretch. Just sort of stand in your at your table, just stretch. And